So our next presenter is Dr. Céline Guérin. She is a French-speaking peak states therapist, and she also has a PhD in neurosciences. After her PhD, she worked in psychiatry and explored different alternative healing practices before discovering peak states therapy. She's now receiving individual clients for peak states therapy in Sophia Health Center in Lausanne, Switzerland, but also worldwide with online peak states therapy sessions. She specializes in stress management, burnout, sexual abuses, and self-esteem issues. She's part of the peak states research and training teams, and also delivers, is one of our trainers for our spiritual emergency training. So Céline is here to talk about the transmission of psychological trauma through generations. So Céline, over to you.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, everybody, to be here. I'm very happy to talk at this third symposium. And I want also to thank Mary and Gaëtan for the beautiful talk. So on my side, I want to talk about transmission of psychological trauma through generation. I want to go a bit further on this mechanism and to show you how biology and peak state model are going in the same way and trying to explain and give us an understanding of the mechanism involved actually in this transgenerational trauma transmission and how it completes what we observe in psychology. Personally, I was always very interesting to try to understand my behaviors and others' behaviors and what is giving us this emotion. And I think here you will have a few answers on this question. So probably you have already observed some traits of character inside yourself or your loved one that could be like gift or burden, and that are coming from your parents or even your grandparents. So I give you here a few examples, like maybe you feel full of energy, or you are a lucky person, you are successful. And on the other side, you can be not resistant to stress, maybe late or feeling depressed. And very often we have this feeling that this is me. Even if you ask to somebody, oh, you are an angry person, and please change something, and the person would answer, no, I cannot change, this is me. So we have this tendency to identify to those heritage of our parents and grandparents. But if you think this is your nature, we will see here that maybe we can change something about this. Before, to understand this transgenerational transmission, we need to talk quickly about trauma. And to give you a short definition of what is a trauma, it's physical or psychological injury that will impact a person's psychology and well-being. For example, it could be abuse, war, aggression, accidents, natural disasters, or loss of a loved one. And those trauma have long-lasting consequences on the person. It could include fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, and even lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality, anxiety, or depression. So it means all the trauma you can go through during your life will have effects on your emotions. And psychology shows that not only your own trauma, but even the trauma of your parents can affect who you are and how you react to external events. So psychology shows that there is unconscious transmission of trauma to the next generation, even if you are not directly exposed to the trauma. For example, some parents who went through war or other trauma will influence offspring's behaviors, health, and well-being. And there is many studies about that now. The first example was observed in the offsprings of Holocaust survivors. They were psychologically more affected than the parents, even if they were not directly exposed to the trauma. This is some observations that were made by Rakoff in 1966. And what other studies later on have shown is that there is an increased vulnerability to PTSD and other psychiatric disorders among offsprings of Holocaust survivors. How this trauma parental trauma transmission is explained in psychology, there is a few theories. We are talking about transfer of the parental trauma. It means the offspring could repeat the parental trauma. We talk also about ghost of the trauma, like if the offspring could feel the ghost of the unspoken trauma, even without knowing its existence. We observe also some displacement phenomenon, like when the trauma is told, offsprings can copy the associated defense mechanism, even if the trauma start to be more accepted, there is still those defense mechanisms that could stay. And what we observe is that the consequences in the offspring can be worse if the trauma is unspoken, but in both cases, there is a transmission. For example, there is 2 case studies of 2 different descendants of war soldiers. In the first case, the father was explaining what he went through during the war, and the daughter was affected, psychologically affected and depressed. In the second case, the consequences were even worse, and the daughter of the daughter, so the granddaughter of the soldier, already also has some psychiatric problems. So we can observe that those parental trauma or those trauma in a person can affect the offsprings for at least 3 generations. This is what psychology is telling us. There is also a process of selection and amplification that could happen, and it means the emotional charge can increase with the generation. Some people are suffering without knowing why. And when they have an overview of their lives, they don't really understand what could create those emotional reactions. And when they go a bit further and they explore the story of their ancestor, then they realize that they could be affected by this memory of the ancestors without knowing before that they were existing. What we can observe is that offspring do not always manifest the same disorder than the parents. They can develop, for example, a variety of disorders like anxiety, depression, low resistance to stress, phobia, behavioral and attachment disorders, and even psychosomatic diseases. So again, let's remember here that the parental trauma could affect the kids even before the conception of the kid. And it will be worsened by the own trauma of the kid during his own life. But how to explain those observations? What is the understanding of biology in this parental trauma transmission? So if we go back in our own life, all those trauma will affect some epigenetic marks, will create some new epigenetic marks. Some professors are talking about DNA scar. Actually, epigenetic marks are some chemical modification that will affect the expression of some genes without changing the DNA, sequence. And those epigenetic marks that can be related to trauma will be involved in the expression of genes involved in stress regulation. For example, it will affect the HPA circuits. It means hypothalamic pituitary adrenal circuits. It's a bit difficult to say. It's the circuit that will produce adrenaline and cortisol, this stress hormone. So we can see that if there is a trauma, it will affect the stress regulation, and we can see this mediated probably through these epigenetic marks. We can also observe that there is an increasing in the number of epigenetic marks related to the severity of the trauma and the number of abuse. But the worst, the moment where we are more vulnerable to those trauma and to the epigenetic marks, it's the very early stages after birth. So for the kids who are stressed at that moment, means separated from the mom, or any violence exposition, then they will develop even more PTSD or other psychological disorder later on in life. So to make a resume about what I just said, imagine this is the trauma. If you have a few trauma during your life, you will be able to still cope functionally in your life, and you will not develop a PTSD. You can have some emotional reaction, of course, but not major problem. But the more trauma you have in your life and the more severe they are, then you have more risk to develop PTSD and even other psychological affection, as I said, borderline depression and anxiety. This is what we observed in those studies at different levels, like psychology and biology. Now, if we go one step before, so we have seen that there is biological marks that we can observe during trauma, during your life after birth. But what's happened when during the conception, when you are in the womb of your mom? Some studies have shown that there is some biological mark and markers that are affected by trauma during pregnancy. For example, during the attack of the 11/11, a study have shown some low salivary cortisol in the children of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder mother. And the same in Tutsi genocide. And in these studies, they were also able to look at other biological markers like glucocorticoid and the methylation on those genes in a HPA axis. And they observed the same in the traumatized mother and in their baby. It means it does exist a biological risk factor for the kids whose pregnant mom were exposed to PTSD to develop themselves a PTSD. And the stress of the pregnant man can affect the baby brain development. This we know that it's possible biologically, but we still don't really understand how the epigenetic marks can be transmitted to the baby, because they have to cross the placental barrier. So the hypothesis of biologists are this signal or transmission could happen through hormones or small RNA. You heard before in the talk of Gaëtan that we have also hypotheses for this transmission going through primary cell. But anyway, the risk is increased by their own trauma exposition during childhood. So it's like there is a threshold and there is a potentialization of the trauma that happened before birth and after birth. There is another question concerning the parental trauma transmission that is not really easy to answer biologically. And this question is about what is the part of the epigenetic transmission of the trauma, the directly epigenetic transmission, and what is the part of the trauma that could be due to early childhood because of the behaviors of traumatized parents. It means for the mice, for example, it's easier to study this because you can separate the kids from the mom, but of course in human studies this is much more difficult to separate what is completely due to epigenetic and so nature and what is due to the part of education, what we call nurture. So now what we call transgenerational transmission for biology, because until now I talk about the trauma, the life trauma, we could say, after birth, the trauma before birth, but transgenerational trauma is even, it would be the trauma of the parents before your own conception. And even here, it's not exactly the same definition for us. And what I observe in literature, in biology, it's not always clear at what point we are talking about transgenerational transmission, because sometimes we are talking about parental transmission or preconception of parental trauma. It's for this subject is, in my opinion, quite complex. So the transmission of preconception parental trauma should happen only if the epigenetic modification happens in germ cells. So all along the life of the parents before the procreation. I will show you a figure after just to make you understand this a bit better. In rodents, we observe a transgenerational transmission of epigenetic modifications due to stress exposure that remains for several generations. But again, for human, it's much more difficult to have the same conclusion, and we need further studies. And the other interesting thing is that there is 2 moments where there is a complete epigenome erasure in the life of a person. It means all the marks that you could have from your parents or even your grandparents, they should be deleted. There is like a complete reset. So we don't really understand why some of those marks will remain. Those 2 moments are in the germ cell. So it means in this germ cell, it will be the beginning of the existence of the genetic and epigenetic heritage of a person. And just after the conception, when the sperm fertilizes the oocytes. Again, the transgenerational transmission depends on the severity of the trauma. Fortunately, not every trauma will be transmitted. So this is the figure to try to understand all the things I said till now. So you can have trauma all your life after birth that will impact your emotions and psychology and well-being. But you can also have go through trauma when you were in the womb of your mom. It means maybe it could be your mom that was infected or ingested something not good with toxin, or she was exposed to pollution or drugs. And this could affect you when you were so in her womb. But even before, so before the conception, the egg that is half of you and the sperm that is the other half of you can also be affected. It looks like the oocytes are more vulnerable during the early age of your mother, because we can see on this figure that the epigenetic reprogramming is not exactly the same for men and women. For men, it's happened only in the germ cell, and at birth, for example, in your father, at birth, all the epigenetic marks and the reprogramming is finished. Whereas for women, so for your mom, for example, the reprogramming is not finished until the end of the puberty. So to go back on this timeline, let's understand that it's like if your consciousness or your life or not your life, the beginning of the epigenetic marks that can affect your life later on will start here in your maternal grandmother, and the same in your paternal grandmother. Because at this moment, there is this 2 reprogramming that should erase all the trauma from before, but some of them can remain, and this is probably where there is the transmission of transgenerational trauma. So again, everything that can happen to your mom through all her life and to your grandmother when she was pregnant of your mom could affect you in the present. This is quite amazing, but actually biology is also supporting this idea that the trauma, as far as starting in your maternal grandmother, will affect you in the present. And it's the same on the sperm side. You can be affected by some trauma that happened when your paternal grandmother was pregnant of your father. So what is the current knowledge for biology? Trauma in the mother before puberty could affect germ cells, but there is no proof of that. So we are talking about this moment in the germ cell of your mother. No studies to examining this possibility in either animal or human sample. Oocytes in haploid demethylated state until puberty, therefore are more vulnerable to environmental perturbations. This is what I told you. And there is a potential contribution of both in utero effects and possibly preconception epigenetic changes to gametes. It means even when your mom is in the womb of your grandmother, we cannot really talk about transgenerational transmission if it doesn't affect the germ cell, because we can imagine that it could affect, for example, your mom regulation to stress system, so her brain, but not the germ cell of your mom. This is when it's a bit complicated. Offspring effects may be mediated by epigenetic changes in parental germ cells resulting from acquired parental stress exposure throughout life. But anyway, if there is all these points that are not 100% understood and proven in human, it's proven in rodents, and we cannot argue that people feel affected, or we cannot say that it's not true that people feel affected by the consequences of trauma exposure in previous generation. Let's see now how our peak state model is a bit solving this problem and make it, in my opinion, a bit more simple. So the same way we consider that trauma during life will affect us, and trauma in our conception, so in the womb of our mom, will affect us, and even later on, because it's like there is a line that will create from the germ cell of our parents in our grandmother. There is like a line until the conception, and same way for the sperm. And those cells will determine what kind of epigenetic marks we have at conception and we have later on in life. So all the trauma that could happen on this timeline will be biographical trauma for us. So we don't talk about transmission, parental trauma transmission. We all understand those trauma as biographical trauma. This is why I say make it a bit more simple. And those trauma can start in the maternal grandmother or in the paternal grandmother, or a bit later, or even later on in life. And what our model is explaining is that we have a line, or what we call a trauma string, that will always affect the same gene expression. And before the grandmother, on the maternal and the paternal side, this is what we will call the generational trauma. So if there is any trauma before the conception of our parents, this is when we will talk about generational trauma. Now, let's see how we observe and how we experience those trauma inside our body, because this is probably the most interesting for us as human beings. To understand what we feel in the body, let's understand a bit more about this trauma string. So as I told you, there is different trauma moments on one trauma string. And if we go in one trauma moment, for example, if you think about one trauma in the past, where you had some physical sensation and maybe probably a trauma sentence like, I'm not good enough, or you felt depressed, or you felt angry. So it could have an emotion, but it's not an obligation. But most of the time, almost all the time, you have this out-of-body experience when you are a trauma moment. It means when you go back in this memory, you will see yourself from the outside. So what is interesting in our model is that we have this repetition. We understand that one trauma string is a repetition of trauma moments. And in each of these trauma moments, there is the same emotion, same physical sensation, and same trauma sentence. So both biographical and generational, they are simple trauma. It means all the symptoms along the trauma string, they are the same than in the first moment of the trauma, and they correspond to the physical damage, so what we would call epigenetic mark. And what is interesting is how we feel them in our body. If you go back in one of these moments, to a trauma moment when you had an emotion, then if you go back inside your body in that moment, you will feel an emotion and probably the shape of the emotion inside your body. So we can, for example, feel like a contracted ball somewhere in our throat, in our chest, in our belly. But there is differences between biographical and generational trauma, because they are not felt the same in the body. For example, the biographical trauma, so it means since the beginning, if you remember, the beginning of the creation of the germ cell in your grandmother that will become the egg or the sperm. Then if it's a trauma along this line, starting even as far as your grandmother, you will feel it as a crumple bag. And Gaëtan talked about it before. He was talking about the ribosomes. So those feelings as a reality in our body. And for the generational trauma, it's more felt like a round pearl. We don't exactly know what is the structure related to that in the cell. So for the biographical trauma, again, along the biographical trauma string, there is some trauma moments that are stored and that are from our life, as I said, starting as far as inside the primordial germ cell of our parents in our grandmothers. And it's still the same repeated symptom in different stories. For example, I had a client, let's call her D, and she announced, her boss announced her that the project she was working on is now under the responsibility of her colleague. So she was really angry in that moment, and she felt a contraction like a ball in the belly. And the trauma sentence was, it's unfair. And she had exactly the same symptoms at the age of 22 when her boyfriend cheated on her, and also at the age of 4 when a friend didn't want to play with her. So this is exactly the kind of memories that we can find along a biographical trauma string. For the generational trauma string, in all along the trauma string is not moment from your life, but it will be trauma moment from our ancestors that are stored there. And they start at our grandparents before our parents' conception, and we are able sometimes to go very far in the past. The difference of the generational trauma, if you remember my first slide, is also that it feels much more personal, like I am that, I am an angry person, I am a late person, I cannot make it, I cannot do better. So an example is Mr. P, who was also a client, and he was getting angry very often and easily, so much that his friends would be very careful to never offend him because he could explode for any reason and at any time. For example, he was getting angry several times a week, and he was describing exactly this feeling of explosion inside associated with back pain and nervosity. And the trauma sentence was, I will get you. In this case, actually, when we did the healing of the first ancestor, it appeared that he was attacked, physically attacked and physically hurt in the back. So I insist on this superposition of what's going on in the cell because of epigenetic damage that will block the expression of the gene. And in our body, we can feel, for example, the ribosome in a biographical trauma and this round structure pearl for generational trauma. And the good news is that the Peak State Institute has developed precise and reproducible protocols to treat generational traumas and also biographical trauma, but here I'm more interested in generational traumas. So both of them, they can be released in 90 seconds if there is an emotion, 90 seconds. If there is no emotion, that it could be a bit longer, because in this case, we need to use regression and to heal the first ancestor or the first trauma moment for biographical. Let me give you a few examples of what kind of experience the clients could have and the person who are doing this trauma healing techniques will experience. So for example, a client was able to experience a grandmother when she was being locked in a basement as a child. So she had absolutely no idea of that even before, and she has seen very clear images. She was quite shocked when she confirmed that story with her mom a few days after that. So we can have those very clear memories of our ancestors, that in this case was a close ancestor, a grandmother. But sometimes we can go very far. And in another case, I had a client who was able to regress to a prehistoric ancestor that was hurt. Now, another example of what we can heal with those techniques. So one of my clients experimented the story of an ancestor who had lost everything, and he was looking at his village burning from far away. And at that moment, the sentence was, what's the point to continue now? And it was the same despair that she was experiencing like in the background all her life. And we did the healing, and she really experienced a beautiful release after that, and even went through a big experience. So it means amazing state of consciousness after that healing. Another client whose grandparent lost all his possessions, and in this case, the client was scared to earn money in his life, in his current life, or in her current life. And she figured out that one of her ancestors had to renounce to all her money and possession to survive during revolution. And when we healed that, then she was able to earn money the week after. So in conclusion, life trauma impact our emotions and psychology through epigenetic marks. And those negative effects on behavior and emotions can be transmitted to our children and to their own children. So it's a huge responsibility. So let's take care of our traumas to not transmit them to our children and grandchildren. And I would like also to say to psychologists and biologists who could be interested in those research projects to contact me, because we are really looking for academic research partners. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any question, I will try to be here tonight in the panel to answer to them.